In today's webinar for the Gay Counseling Training Hub, we have Samer, and he's going to tell us about his research. And the three things that counselors should be looking for in today's video is around bears, the context of bears within the gay men's community, and dating success, fetishization, and physical health. These three topics will impact how counselors counsel bears. So Samer, tell us what you found in your research.
First of all, thanks, Scott. This research, as you mentioned, it's about bears, and they are a sub-community of the gay and bi men. For those who don't know about bears, bears tend to be the bigger guys. They have larger frames, hairier bodies. They tend to have more facial hair, things. So they have a very stereotypical masculine, heterosexual, if you wish, look. So previous work about bears, which isn't very vast so far, we need more research to understand them a little bit more, but so far we found that they've reported high self-perceived masculinity, lower self-esteem, more frequent engagement in condomless anal sex, greater number of sexual partners, and higher rates of HIV. And we aimed in this study to understand a little bit more about the self-perceived masculinity versus femininity, dating success, condom use, and relationship power, and inhibitory cognitions and depression. Our sample wasn't too big. It was 214 individuals, out of which 74 were bears. And the results showed some things that overlapped with previous research, but other things that were a little different. So in terms of masculinity and femininity, we were very similar to other studies, and bears did rate themselves higher on masculinity and lower on femininity. They rated themselves as having higher dating success, rated as well as having a higher sense of power in relationships. And what we found in our sample is that they had a more direct approach to requesting condoms. In fact, they always had some strategy for condom insistence. We didn't find any significant differences in inhibitory cognitions or depression. So that was different from previous studies. We kind of tried to make sense of these results, and we mostly attributed these results to a strong group identity. It feels like our group is doing pretty well in terms of dating success, sense of power in relationship, and insisting on condom use. Previous studies that showed, like the gay strength study in the past from our lab, showed that the stronger sense of community, the better off people are. And this is probably what's going on in our sample of bears.
Okay. And so what you found different from the previous studies was around the self-esteem and power, sense of power in relationships?
We didn't really study self-esteem. We didn't really test for self-esteem in our study, but it feels like our bears were doing pretty well in terms of dating success and sense of power in relationships. So you'd think maybe those guys have less, have more self-esteem than what the studies indicated. We don't really know, but it could be that there are bears who are doing better than others, or these results show that maybe bears have higher sense of power in relationships, but may have lower self-esteem in other social interactions.
Okay, so in terms of what counselors should be aware of, it sounds like there may be sort of two subgroups within the bears. On research is showing that some bears may have lower self-esteem and also not say no to sex.
That's right.
And then your research is finding that bears have a higher sense of power when they're within relationships and are having successful relationships because of that.
It's probably important to ask what the nature of the relationship is. because if other studies are showing that they're less likely to say no to sex, then that could be stemming from their low self-esteem. Whereas our study is saying that they have higher sense of power in the relationship. So it's good to understand what every individual is like, because it's probably important for whatever they're dealing with.
Yeah. So let's move on to about the fetishization of bears.
Right.
We've talked before about the narrative around larger men and how it has negative connotations, and that's very different from inside the gay community. Tell us how bears are fetishized within the gay world.
So it feels like the the bear community stemmed out of self-acceptance. So the gay community in general always seeks to be proud of who they are and not be ashamed of, all the stigma that surrounds being gay. Now, also, there's a lot of stigma about being fat, and that probably is the driving force of the bear community, is that we're not ashamed of our bodies. We like who we are. We actually admire who we are. So it went from being a shameful thing to be fat to being an admired thing to be a bear. Now, the studies don't really test for causality. Is a fat person calling themselves a bear to get into this group of people and to be accepted, or as a skinny person trying to become part of the bear community by becoming fat? So is being fat a result of the bear community or a cause? Do you see what I mean? So there are people who might feel that I want to belong to this bear community, so I want to gain that weight or muscle or beef up or whatever it is to be accepted in that community. Whereas other people find this community to be sort of a safe space for them because they are fat, because they are big, and they might not be accepted in other communities. So there might be this difference.
Well, so I guess that's a big experiential asset that all queer people have that straight people don't necessarily have. So when we come out as being gay publicly, we have to go through the self-acceptance of who we are as sexual beings and our sexual orientation. And it sounds like that learning process of coming out can be extended to also accepting your body for what it is.
That's
And
true.
those experiences around sexuality aren't experienced in the straight community. So they can't necessarily extend that experience to also accepting the body. And I think the dominant narrative in the straight dominant culture is not sexualized men who are bigger, but we definitely in the gay community images, narratives often see bears sexualized.
That's true. Something else about the fetishization of bears, when it comes to masculinity and femininity, they do tend to have this outer look of, hyper masculine, straight man, yet they're not afraid of showing affection, which is typically considered feminine, but it doesn't really make them feel less masculine at all. It doesn't affect their sense of masculinity.
Okay. So there's this sort of rolling in of what's typically a feminine trait or behavior, but it's been co-opted within the gay community and specifically within the bear sub-community as being acceptable and favorable.
Exactly.
So we touched on what counselors need to be aware of, bears and dating and self-esteem and power within relationships. We touched on the fetishization of bears within the gay community and how that's in contrast to the straight community.
Mhm.
And then there's also the physical health around bears, and there's also aspects of that that counselors need to be aware of.
Bears went through this whole acceptance of their body if there's what we call acceptance of the body, or at least acknowledging that other guys are attracted to this body, they might feel a little reluctant to lose the weight to become healthier. And you'd find a lot of physical health problems in the bear community in terms of mainly diabetes and high blood pressure. And when they go to their healthcare provider, oh, you got to lose the weight, you got to exercise, you need to do those things to become healthier. It's important not only for counselors, but also healthcare providers to understand that might not be easy to have the motivation to lose weight or to change the body because they're getting admired, they're getting eroticized with that figure. This is an asset for them.
Right. So counselors sort of taking the narrative of the health system, saying that thin is the way to be healthy, may have a tendency and a bias towards encouraging clients and bear clients to lose weight, to be healthier, which comes into conflict with the messages that bears receiving, that they're eroticized, they're fetishized, that they're desirable at the size they are. So I guess for counselors, it's sort of discerning between being physically healthy and
sexually healthy, enjoying their sexual life as well. I mean, the message could be in terms of you don't need to be thin to be healthy. It's important to understand where that's coming from, because being thin is a loss for them. It might be a gain in terms of physical health, but it could be a loss of community. It could be a loss of, dating success. So it's a little tricky in that sense.
so a bear may express a desire to be more healthy, but a counselor shouldn't automatically interpret that as a desire to lose weight.
That's right. That's yes. These are the exact words.
And it may be more around eat better eating habits or getting more exercise, but not necessarily with the goal of losing weight.
That's true. And you see it a lot in terms of, if you go on social media and you look at all those bear profiles, they're all like, they go to the gym and they're big guys, and they do not have any intention of losing that weight. It's just showing they're being fit, they're being healthy by exercising but not losing the weight.
I mentioned to you the other day about a colleague I had who was a counselor, and we often see in the gay community a higher level of body image issues within gay men. And so I had a colleague who shall remain nameless, who was very much concerned about his body, and he was going to the gym all the time, and he had very low body fat and very high muscle mass, and by anybody's standards, he was a pretty hot looking guy. He went down to Puerto Vallarta by himself one spring break, and it just happened to be Bear Week. And because he was down there alone, he befriended a bunch of bears and hung out with them all weekend. And when he came back, his big insight was that because all of these bears accepted their bodies for the way they were, this allowed my friend to accept his body the way it was, and it really lowered his anxiety around his body image issues.
Yeah, it's interesting, the whole accepting and being admired for who you are. I see on my social media people who'd never considered themselves as bears going to those bear events.
What do you think that's about?
What I mentioned before, they're not afraid of showing affection, and they're actually quite inclusive. I would say most bear communities, they're very inclusive. There are some bear communities around the world that are extremely exclusive, and they wouldn't allow anyone who's not a bear in. But in general, bears are quite inclusive, and they tend to show love to everybody. So it might be attractive for people who aren't bears as well.
Right. Yeah. Going into a community or a space or an environment where everybody's very accepting and loving and accepting of who they are, that's got to be attractive.
True.
Well, Samer, thanks for sharing your research and your lived experience. And for the counselors out there, there's three things that you shared with us that's important for them to consider when they have bears as clients, and that's around dating success and the different aspects of that, the fetishization of bears, which we don't see in any of the straight community, at least not that I'm aware of, and then also the physical health and how that's defined by bears, and that may run in or run up against the dominant narrative of thinner is better.
My pleasure, and I hope this helps.
Great. Thank you, Samer.
All right, thanks.